Okay, well, welcome everyone to today's seminar. Before I introduce our speaker, I'll just mention there's a few new faces always, so I'll mention that this is a weekly seminar series in term time, 4:15 every Friday in this lecture theatre. Just go to our Oxford Nature Network events if you want to sign on and get the mailing list. But just to mention the next couple of weeks, next week we've got Professor Kate Jones from UCL talking about AI and nature recovery and the role of AI and technology in monitoring nature recovery. And the week after we have Guy Shrubsole talking about the history of land inequality in England and its role in how we think about nature recovery in England. So both of them fascinating talks. And so moving on to today, it's a great pleasure to welcome Lee, who we've been collaborating for over several decades now in the context of Gabon and the Congo Basin. And Lee first he studied in zoology at UCL and in tropical ecology at the University of Edinburgh, and first went to Gabon in 1989 for your PhD work, initially as an ecologist, but then working through the Wildlife Conservation Society and then beyond, built up the conservation network, the National Park Network in Gabon, was director of the National Park Service, and then went on to be a minister in the government, but also beyond Gabon, was very vocal in Gabon's leading role in championing African environment and rainforests in the climate negotiations and beyond, so very much involved in the international climate and nature diplomacy activities. And I'm sure we'll hear more about your experiences then and beyond then as well. And he is currently an honorary professor at Stirling University and a special envoy to the science panel for the Congo Basin, and has authored a range of papers and books on his work. So great to have you here, Lee. Over to you.
Thanks, Linda. It's nice to be here. I gave a talk, the Christmas lecture in Falmouth to the university that's being ranked second on earth, I think, in terms of ecology teaching. And so now I'm in the university that was ranked first. I'm not sure who was third. I think I have to go to America to get the third one. I am going to basically tell you a story, and I will integrate science into it because we're in a university and you guys all do science, and I will maybe integrate a bit of the politics. And when I left Gabon a couple of years ago, I sat down and I'd in a way was a victim of a military coup. I lost my job because a military dictator fired me, and I needed some therapy. So I sat down and wrote a book. And writing the book, I thought a lot about how did I end up spending kind of 50 years of my life, 45 years of my life as a rainforest ecologist, conservationist, and so on. And many of my thoughts went back to my upbringing in Uganda. And this is a young Lee, slightly blonder version of Lee. That's probably taken in 1970. That is Cedric next to me, who is an orphan chimpanzee whose family were killed by poachers, who was inherited by my parents. And my mother used to walk around with Cedric on one hip in his nappy and my sister Alison on the other hip in her nappy. And occasionally when people used to deliver milk in churns to the door, occasionally the milkman would suddenly realize one of these babies was hairy and black and a bit strange. But so I'm going to tell you the story about the chimpanzee's brother, and something I think a lot about is who is going to speak up for nature in all of these global negotiations that go on, where most of the negotiators are lawyers or diplomats. Just occasionally you get scientists in there, biologists, but nobody's really speaking for nature. And my strange life led me from being the chimpanzee's brother in Uganda, having been born in Manchester, to speaking for 1.3 billion Africans at the Glasgow Climate COP, where Gabon was chairing the African negotiators. And I happened to be called Lee White. So a little bit like Johnny Cash's Boy Named Sue, I've had to live with this name as, you know, over my 45 years working in Africa. Now, I went to Gabon. I'd worked in Sierra Leone, I'd worked in Nigeria, but Gabon was really my first science project. I'd worked on conservation projects in Nigeria. I'd done a little bit of forest ecology. I convinced myself I wanted to do a PhD, and I was going to do a PhD on how forestry impacts wildlife. And I chose to do it in Lopé in Gabon, which was a wildlife reserve where animals were protected, but the habitat wasn't. So they were doing logging, but there was actually almost no hunting. So I could separate out the issue of the physical impact of logging on vegetation from the fact that in many places where people do logging, the hunters use the roads and shoot all the wildlife. So you can't really distinguish those things. And I sat down in a little office in Edinburgh in around October 1988, I guess, and designed this study where I would have 5 different study areas logged at different times in the past, and I would compare the vegetation in those studying areas that were recovering from logging or about to be logged, and I would look at the animal densities across those different sites, and rather simplistically, I would then try and elucidate which of the differences I could attribute to logging. And I walked into this ecosystem, this very complex, diverse tropical rainforest ecosystem with no botanical training whatsoever, but with a study design that required that I get to know the plants as well as the animals. And as I walked in there, it was sort of, you know, 1,000 shades of green, but I couldn't actually tell the difference between any of these plants. I went to a place called the Station d'études des gorilles des chimpanzés, the chimpanzee and gorilla and chimpanzee research station, set up in 1983 by Caroline Chutin, a British primatologist. She studied with Jane Goodall in Gombe. She did her PhD in Gombe with Jane Goodall. And the chimpanzee that she most resembled was called Myth. So Caroline Chutin, we fondly call her Myth. It's been her nickname since her Gombe days. She did a national survey of Gabon in the late 70s, early 80s, and surprised the world by estimating there were 35,000 gorillas and 64,000 chimps in Gabon, at a time when scientists thought there were only 5,000 of each on the whole of the African continent. And suddenly Gabon became this interesting place. As she set up her study, a massive civil engineering project built a railway right across the center of Gabon from the northwest to the southeast. And that was about to result in an explosion of forestry. And so I was, when I wrote to her, when you're trying to set yourself up to do a PhD, you write to all these eminent scientists. She was the only one who replied to me of the 30 or so letters I sent out. And she replied because of what is on the screen there was about to happen to the whole of central Gabon that had previously been inaccessible to forestry. So we're in the Congo Basin. We're in the Lopé Reserve, which is right in the geographical center of Gabon. On that map of Gabon, it's a radar image. The blue is savanna and the green is forest. So 88% covered by rainforest to this day. And Lopé Reserve, as it was, National Park, now World Heritage Site, is a mix of, it's probably 85% forest, 15% savanna, with a backbone of hills going up to just over 900 meters. And as I said, I was transported into this system I'd spent a little bit of time walking around the rainforests of West Africa. I could recognize two trees. The ironwood tree, called the Zobe in Gabon, Lophiura alata, which have these incredible, colors aren't great there, but incredible red young leaves around Christmas time in Gabon. And quite a characteristic orangey, rough orangey trunk. So when you encounter it in the forest, you see the orange trunk, and if you take off a little bit of the outer bark, there's a very bright yellow underbark. So it's quite easy to identify. I could also do the kapok tree, which is one of these pan-tropical things that people used to use to make pillows. And that was it. The other, and I got to know 2,000 plants, and Lope probably 1,000 trees. So the other 998 were a total mystery to me. In that sort of chimpanzee analogy, I was an orphan chimpanzee who hadn't lived with my mother in the forest and hadn't had that 5 years apprenticeship learning all of the plants that you can eat and that are good for you. I was the orphan chimpanzee, bewildered by the biodiversity of the rainforest. Now, I'm illustrating the plants today with Kate, my wife's wonderful watercolors. And I'm doing it because each illustration is a bit like a Chinese character. It tells us what the species is, but behind that, there's a whole learning about the ecology of the species and what its role is in the forest and who eats its fruits or its leaves and so on. And it kind of represents a learning journey where I eventually realized that I was learning a different language. There's a history recorded in the distribution of these different plant species that was never written down. Written history in Gabon starts about 500 years ago, but that you can use to understand what has happened in the past. And I gradually started, a few of the species were quite visible. The azobe with the red leaves, Dacryodes, a beautiful golden trunk with leaves, very dark green leaves, but with a golden fluffy underside, and fruits that are really good as a sort of olive replacement with your gin and tonic in the evening. You pour hot water onto them and suck them, and they're sort of like a resinous olive. Yeah, a few of the species were quite flamboyant. So if you happen to see the tulip tree, Spathodea, that actually you may well have seen if you've been to Peru. Many tropical cities have this tree now that comes from Africa, but it's been planted all around the world. The tulip tree, when it's got its flowers on, at least, is pretty easy to recognize. Silicodiscus is a kind of a great big bean. Those pods are about this long. So if there are pods hanging off the tree, or if there are pods on the ground, it's another one that's quite easy to recognize. Philiopsis, the pod there is a parchment-like pod, about so long, 40, 50 centimeters long. Really good for writing love letters to your darling wife. A bit like a sort of an Egyptian parchment. Interestingly, there are fossil Philiopsis dating back 25 million years into the Miocene. And so it gives us a clue to the complexity of the biodiversity patterns that we're going to find in the African rainforest, because they've been around for 25 million years, and lots of things happened to our planet during the course of those 25 million years. And if you're going to really understand the forest, you have to be thinking on those sorts of timescales to really work it out. Now, I came from a world, I was sort of focused on large mammals, primates, large mammals. I wanted to study rainforest elephants and gorillas and things. So a zoologist. When I asked to do a plant taxonomy course in my zoology degree in University College London, my enlightened tutor told me, Lee, you're a zoologist. If you want to know about plants, you can read a book. These days, I think interdisciplinary work is a bit more kind of understood and valued. As a zoologist working with a team of people who are zoologists, the people I was working with were mostly interested in understanding which were the plants that the gorillas and chimpanzees that they were studying were eating and were infecting their lives. They found it very difficult to habituate the lowland gorillas that we have in Gabon. My granny could habituate a mountain gorilla group because they live in a bowl of salad and you can basically follow them around all the time. The lowland gorillas are frugivores that walk through a much sparser understory, leaving much less sign behind them. It takes 5, 6, 7 years to get them used to people. And so most people who studied gorillas early on spent most of their time peering at their poo and sieving their poop and working out what seeds were in the poop, and then working out from that what the chimps and gorillas were doing. And so one example, a tree called Cola lizai. Cola is the tree that gives its name to Coca-Cola, along with Erythroxylum coca, the source of natural cocaine from Peru. The commonest tree in the gorilla study area in Lope turned out to be a new species of cola that was discovered in the dung and then found as a living tree, and eventually became Cola lizai, named after the first PhD student there in Lope. It's one of the most easily recognized trees with great big leaves, sometimes up to about 120 centimeters across. And, oh dear, on my screen, oh, there she is. On my screen, that's Elsa with a cola leaf. My first teacher was Miff. So Miff is the chimpanzee name of Caroline Chutin. And Caroline basically behaved like a chimpanzee in the sense of walking around the forest looking at the vegetation and the plants. She'd learnt all of the plants that the chimps and gorillas were eating. She would look at a tree and tell you, that's an Avingia gabonensis. She'd look at it from maybe 50 yards away. And I think she was using branching patterns and canopy form and stuff. But when you asked her, well, how do you know it's an Avingia gabonensis? She often wouldn't be able to tell you. She just knew. She was walking around the forest like a chimpanzee. She kind of learnt to recognize these things by finding the fruit underneath, but looking at the tree from afar. She developed a phenology circuit where she was looking at the trees from afar, a bit like a chimp or a gorilla would, to see if it has fruit on it. And so she showed me my first trees, but it was really difficult learning from her without trailing around behind her for 5 years. I then met a forester, a forest botanist who was a forester, and the way he looked at trees was to approach the tree on the ground up to the trunk. He'd look at the buttresses and whatever the bark, and then he'd take out a matchet and cut into the bark and see what exudates came out, what the color was, what the smell was. Did the smell change as it oxidized? He was, in a way, a better teacher because it was a bit more scientific. It's, what's the color of the bark? What's the color of the exudate? What does the smell like? You could almost make a botanical key based on those features. And only at the very end would he actually look up at the tree to see the leaves and so on, because sometimes the leaves are 70 meters above you. My last teachers in a way, were the trees, but scientists who had gone through the process of identifying things, and luckily enough for me, had tagged some of these trees in permanent plots. And one particular one, a gentleman called Jan Reitsma, a Dutch botanist, had done a study of, he'd wanted to study primary rainforest in Gabon in the Congo Basin. He'd gone into the forest with a very preconceived idea of what a primary rainforest looks like. So it has a constant canopy, it has lots of big trees, a very clear understory so you can walk through it. And he'd looked at the gorilla study area, which had a lot of dense understory, and had decided that it looked too secondary, and had gone off deep into the Lope Reserve and set up a plot in forest where there were a really high density of really big trees. And he'd put numbered tag on these trees. He'd climbed them all. He'd waited 3 years to have them all flower and so on. And very generously, when I wrote to him, he sent me all of his raw data. And I was able to go and look at the data sheet, the tag, and then start working out the characters of the plants. And slowly, bit by bit, I started to identify 5, 10, 20, 50, 100, and more trees. A few, often there are incidents that happen that help you remember things better. I remember one night my car broke down. I was driving through the savannah at night, a little forest patch next to me. Driving down a hill, the engine stopped, and I'm sitting in the quiet with the beautiful stars, calling on the radio to see if somebody will come and rescue me. And I heard what sounded like pebbles, pebbles on a rocky beach when the waves are going back out, pebbles rolling over themselves. But I'm in the middle of a rainforest or a savanna mosaic, far from the sea. It turned out that it was mandrills, these big colorful mandrills, that had filled their cheek pouches with the seeds of this species of Diallium. And they're like, the sherbet you get in sweet shops? You can still get lemon sherbets, I think. Well, these guys, the flesh of a Diallium tastes a bit like sherbet. It's like a sweet. The seeds are hard as rocks. But the mandrills were up in trees where they sleep, and they were crunching the seeds from the cheek pouches. And there were 700 mandrills, each of them crunching Diallium seeds. And so Diallium, it's actually a new species of Diallium that we found in Lope, is ingrained on my brain because of the sound of pebbles by the beach, but was actually mandrills. Because gorillas and chimpanzees are quite close to humans genetically, we figured that we could taste anything that gorillas and chimps tasted. We could eat anything that they ate. There were a few exceptions, a few things that I didn't taste that they eat, but probably 95% of what they were eating I would taste. And sometimes you got really delicious fruit. So Pentadesma is a big fruit, full of pectin, really good for making jam, really kind of a tangy taste. Trichoscypher, the Gabonese grape, they call it. Kate made ice cream that Haagen-Dazs would have killed for. The problem was you usually didn't find big bunches of fruits like this out in our forest because there were so many chimps and gorillas, they always got there first. This particular forest is near Libreville where there were only 3 or 4 chimps, and that's Iona, our eldest daughter, with Treasure. That makes the best ice cream on the planet. It's really delicious. And so I started compiling, kind of using taste, using sight, using smell to identify all of these things. One day walking along a lovely ridge path So a mountain ridge about 700 meters altitude in sort of cathedral forest, often up in the clouds, so quite misty with lichens and so on hanging off them. I had chimps up ahead, very excited, yeah, pant hooting. Yeah, but many of them, this cacophony of noise. And I snook up to get a good view of them. Now, usually when chimps see you on the ground, they come straight down like a fireman and disappear. In this instance, they were so excited about the fruit that they were eating, they just took one look and went back to the fruit. So I knew it was something good. I waited until they'd come down. I got to watch them for about half an hour. Eventually they came down and I got to taste one of these fruits. Something like a cross between a plum and a lychee. Really one of the best fruits. I could tell immediately why the chimps were so obsessed on this particular tree. But it turned out that this tree only grew above about 550, 600 meters in altitude. So it was part of a plant community that was restricted to the highest hills that actually probably were the places where forests survived during the last glaciation 12,000 years ago. And it did, it proved to be a new species. Kate and I went up when it was flowering and she kind of held the ropes whilst I climbed up to get a sample of the flowers. And Charles Darwin moment, I'm actually one of the scientific authorities on this new species of tree, which is perhaps the chimpanzee's favorite. When I took the seed that day down from the hill and showed it to Miff, to Caroline, she looked at it and she said, "That's number 36. She'd known it for 10 years, but had never found the tree because she didn't climb the 500-meter altitude to go to the top of the Camel Mountain because she'd never actually tracked her chimps and gorillas up there. This species, Omphalocarbon, it has a fruit almost the size of my skull, as hard, if not harder. Yeah. If you get a big heavy hammer and you whack it, you can crack it. You can cut through it with a hacksaw. But it's really difficult to get in to the seeds and to the pulp inside. I found a couple one day in Lope and brought them back to our camp, and put them on the ground. We had this elephant is an elephant called Billy, who was an elephant with a lovely character who used to come into our camp every now and then and eat the cut grass and eat Caroline's tomatoes. And so he came into our camp and smelt the garlicky smell of the Omphalocarbon. And he took it, he knelt down, I have to be kind of out visible. He knelt down, put the end of his tusk onto this fruit, and then put his whole weight down and cracked into it. And inside there are about 20 or so big seeds surrounded in a really kind of gluey sort of pulp. And he lifted that up into his mouth and his eyes went all squint and he A few years later I went to Kahuzi-Biega in DRC and we had to walk 5 days from the road before we found any wildlife. Yeah, people were walking 3 days to put snares for rats. I was meant to be doing a chimp and gorilla survey and literally had to walk 5 days from base camp before we started seeing any elephant dung and any gorilla sign. As we walked out, we met a lot of these trees, and under each tree there was a sort of canopy-sized halo of rotting Omphalocarbon fruit. It was like a a cemetery of the Omphalocarbon because the elephants had been hunted out. Nothing was cracking the fruit and getting in there and dispersing the seeds. And a lot has been written about when the large mammals were hunted out by humans in the Amazon, and people thought about trees disappearing, and the trees still seem to be there. But this particular tree probably is very, very dependent on elephants to break its fruit open and disperse its seeds. I went to do a study for 3 years. I stayed for 35 years, I guess. In 35 years, you see things changing. This in the top, 1994, it's an enclosed savanna that hadn't been burnt for about 5 years at that point, maybe longer, maybe 10 years. And 15 years later, it was a young rainforest. And in the savannas in northern Lope, human lit fires in the dry season maintain the savanna. If you don't have human lit fires in the dry season, the forest expands into the savanna. So we're in a humid climate phase where the forest is expanding into the savanna. And two of the species that were most common in those colonized areas, so two of the rainforest species that colonize the savanna in Lope and can actually establish in bright sunshine, are the akume tree, Akume kleiniana, which is the principal forestry tree. It was the tree that took me to Gabon because it's the tree that makes the best marine plywood on the planet. So all of those luxury yachts that are being confiscated around the world right now, they're all built inside with the marine plywood from Gabonese akume trees. And akume is a wind dispersed, has a seed a bit like a sycamore, disperses its seeds up to about 200 meters from the adult trees. It establishes in savannas and it establishes in big fields produced by slash and burn agriculture, but it will not regenerate in the forest. And so it's not regenerating inside the rainforest, it's only regenerating where you have disturbance. It lives for about 150, 200 years. So it's a marker over about 2 centuries of the fact that there has been disturbance in this place. Sacaglottis is another. This Sacaglottis is a tree dispersed by elephants, not by the wind. The elephants sometimes eat so many of the fruit, the fermenting fruits, that they get a bit drunk. When it's fruiting, the forest smells like a brewery. A lot of the elephant fruit smell very yeasty. And once I got to know Sacaglottis, it was a bit of a eureka moment for me because my friend Jan Reitzmer, who sent me the plot data, in his primary rainforest forest plot, there were 5 or 6 of these trees, azuga trees, huge, 2 meters across, beautiful shaggy bark, strange forms to the canopy. It's the tree that most reminds me of Tolkien's Ents. It talks of sort of ancient rainforest, and that was why Jan chose to put his plot where he did. Except it doesn't regenerate in the forest. Like akume, it's a savanna colonizer and a colonizer of open ground. Unlike akume, it lives longer. It lives probably 500-600 years. And so Jan's primary rainforest plot, deep in the heart of Lope World Heritage Site, was actually an old savanna and had been a savanna about 500 years before. And so as we started putting together the biology of these species, we started thinking about reading the landscape and reading the history of the forest through this distribution of species. Pentaclethra is ingrained on my mind for 2 reasons. One was because it was the source probably of one of the biggest fights Kate and I ever had. She was doing all these illustrations of trees that I had identified, and she happened to choose a pentaclethra tree with exceptionally small, underrepresentative leaves. And when I showed up and annoyed her by looking over her shoulder and then said, "You're doing it wrong, it should be twice as big," you can probably imagine the reaction I got. I also remember it because it occurs, we have a lot of, in the savanna forest mosaic, we have a lot of small patches of forest on the hilltops. Turns out that these small patches of forest were all old villages, so they're archaeological sites, and that the trees established in people's villages. And most of these small patches have got this tree in there, but you can see that it's a legume. It's got this big woody pod that splits, and it's doing ballistic seed dispersal. And the seeds only fly about 30 meters. So for a long time, I was wondering, like, how come I've got all these trees in these patches of forest separated by hundreds of meters from the main forest block, hundreds of meters of savanna that get burnt every year. What are they doing there? Until one of my friends, who was a Chogo from Southern Lope, Chogo is one of the most foresty of the Bantu tribes in Gabon, explained that people used to take the seeds, boil them, pound them into a flour, and if once you've boiled them, they're toxic if they're unboiled, but once you've boiled them, you can use it to make a type of bread. And so it's an important food. Before manioc arrived in Gabon, 500 years or so ago. And so it's a rainforest tree that probably lives 250, 300 years, that was being planted by people, or they were collecting the seeds in the forest, and it was regenerating in their villages. Walking through, a bit like the ridge path where I saw the chimps and discovered the new syncephalum. Walking with Kate one day along an old logging road in what I considered to be primary rainforest, we came across this thing in the middle here. You can see in her illustration that there are sort of tubes coming out. And it turned out, when we kind of looked at it, it's a syzygium tree that I think of as being more mature forest, growing inside an iron furnace. And its roots actually coming through the clay pipes that went into the iron furnace to put the air in to heat it all up. And the charcoal in the furnace carbon dated to 700 years old. And so when we started searching around, we found about 30 of these furnaces in an area of about 10 hectares. And so it was actually a kind of pre-industrial iron smelting factory. And once the people went away, forest had grown, and I come along 600-700 years later, and it looks like primary virgin forest. It's like, I was asked earlier today, what is my favorite tree? And it's probably Bayanella toxisperma, the Moabi tree, which it can grow to up to 5 meters across, 5-meter diameter, and up to 75 meters tall. And it has usually a very, very straight trunk, and it has a big fruit. When the fruit falls from 70 meters and hits the floor, elephants can sense that through their feet at a distance of 10 kilometers. And it lives for 1,000 years and was thought to be an indicator, one of the best indicators of primary forest in the Congo Basin, Western Congo Basin. It's got great big seeds, so the only animal that swallows the seeds is the elephant. And so it was thought that elephants were the exclusive seed dispersers. So it was one of these lovely examples of plant-animal interaction. It's in the Sapitaceae family, which give us argan oil and shea butter. The seeds were traditionally used to make oil. It's quite a dense oil. It's perhaps the best substance there is for moisturizing African ladies' hair. It also deals with skin, it deals with athlete's foot, and it moisturizes skin, and so you can eat it, and it has all sorts of ceremonial uses. You never see the young ones in the forest. There's no apparent regeneration. It turned out that if you find a Bayonella, they tend to live on ridgetops. If you estimate its age from the growth rate, it grows about 1 millimeter a year. Or if you carbon date it in the very middle, and then you dig into the ground, you almost certainly will find pottery and charcoal. Turns out that it's a species that seems only to be growing in archaeological sites from hundreds of years ago. It's a little bit sinister, you do find it regenerating in forestry concessions where they've killed all the animals, or close to villages where there's intense hunting. Because the oil is so nutritious that the pigs and the porcupines and the rodents and everything else basically eat every single seed that is available and prevent any regeneration of this tree. So it's a tree that, at least today, is dependent on human beings. But the oldest ones that have been carbon dated are 950 years old. So it's a marker of 1,000 years of forest history. And so gradually, we were kind of piecing together the ecology of the trees, the interactions with the animals, learning this new language, kind of written in the trees, not written in any books. We gradually kind of transposed that language into science, documenting the way savannas are colonized by forest species and gradually over hundreds of years evolve into more mature forest, documenting how probably 2,500 years ago, there was a period of very intense, a dry period, but with very intense rainfall. You get a lot of stone lines dating back to 2,500 years in the Congo Basin. And a lot of the land was denuded. And you get a succession as vegetation establishes on the rocks, you get a succession as the depth of the soil increases. And we were able to start mapping many of the diosporous species, the ebonies, almost all of which have got delicious fruit. There's one that tastes like a pear drop. There's one that tastes like that big brown one. It's covered in irritant hairs, but if you scrape them off and go into it, it's like a peach melba. These species are very common around rocky areas and in areas with very shallow soils. But then there are other species, like there's a whole group of begonias. Many of you have them in your begonias in your houses. But some very sensitive ones that are exclusively found in the most humid, shady, kind of stable, mature forests. So I think of them a bit like a good wine, a good French wine. It has to be in a cellar, in a very stable conditions to survive. And these things, you can use them to map the forest refuges that go much further back, that go back thousands, tens of thousands of years. Same thing with a lot of the sisal trees with pods. They're a bit more, they're more resilient than the begonias. They can sometimes even grow out in the savanna. They survive kind of a drier habitat, but their pods, when they pop, they'll only send the seeds 10, 20, 30 meters. And so they'll only move 20 meters per generation. So if you imagine a situation where in the last ice age, we had a few mountain refuges of forest and the rest of Central Africa was savanna, it takes a long, long time for these big rainforest trees to travel hundreds of kilometers if they're only moving 30 meters, 20 meters, 10 meters per generation. So you start to you know, the language becomes much more complex the longer you go back. And so you're just, you know, it's as if you can only identify the odd letter or the odd word of the language that's been forgotten. But it gives you little clues into the more ancient story in the forest. Kate and I ended up doing a guide to the vegetation of Lope once we'd identified, I think the list went up to 2,000 species in the end. Kate illustrated about 700 species in her guide to the Lope. And we kept finding new species. This one here is a species of Palisota that we found 10 kilometers from the presidential palace in Libreville, 4 kilometers from the airport in Libreville. Yadvinder knows the Monda Forest. It's a little patch of hyperhumid forest, 3.5 meters of rainfall every year. Most of the hyperhumid forest, which is in the coast, has been destroyed. But this little plant is like a carpet covering the forest floor over a patch of about 10 square kilometers. 10 square kilometers of earth. Turned out to be a new species of Palisota. The poor thing ended up being called Palisota Lee Whitei. I was a bit embarrassed about that, but I'm always looking for stories to tell people, to get people to care about nature. And so when I took President Sarkozy into the forest, as we were walking through a patch of Lee Whitei, I could say to him, Mr. President, please don't step on this plant. I will feel it. This is Lee Whitei, and it only exists on this planet on a radius of about 3 kilometers from where we're standing. That is how biodiverse and how complex these patterns of biodiversity are in the Congo Basin. And so we were able, using all of this information, to start rolling vegetation types back. You can kind of tell a story. We mapped the vegetation as it is today, the big map, and we could detect multiple events in the past that have had an impact on the rainforest in Lope. So around 75 years ago, there was a burst of savanna colonization. We worked out with time that burst of colonization was because the French colonial authorities basically did what the English did to the Scots. There was a clearances in Gabon. The French colonials forcibly moved every single village out of the rainforest of Gabon, settled them along the roads so that they could use them for forced labor. They left the entire rural areas of Gabon completely peopleless. And when you take the people out, their fields become forest again, and they stop burning the savannas, and the forest expands. There was another burst around 1750. That one probably corresponds to the slave trade. People were going all the way to Lope, buying slaves, and there was this sort of trade from the coast to the interior. Again, another spurt of forest expansion because people were coming out of the forest because they were hiding from the slave traders. And another one around 800 AD, we've got an archaeological record in the Congo Basin where there were lots of people before 800 and there are lots of people from about 1300 onwards, but there was a gap of about 400-500 years. You can see in this graph here, during 400-500 years, the archaeological record is very scant. There was a period of about 400-500 years where there were very few people living in the Congo Basin. Before that, from the Iron Age, beginning of the Iron Age onwards, people were cultivating oil palm and bananas and all sorts of things, cutting the forest down. They then disappeared for a period of about 400-500 years, and the forest grew back. And the important timber species that you get in northern Congo today, the mahoganies, the entandrophragmas, all date back to this period when people disappeared and the forest recolonized people's farms. Now, I was meant to speak until now, wasn't I? I think I can wrap it up in about 10 minutes. We went through a similar process with some of the wildlife as well as the plants. It seems incredible that just 30 years ago, we thought there was only one species of elephant in Africa, not two, and nobody, other than a 3-month study in the Ivory Coast, nobody had actually studied the forest elephant. I was going into the forest to try and look at how densities differed across different logging regimes, but I needed to understand the ecology of the species to be able to interpret any differences that I found. It turned out that I actually wrote a paper entitled, "Should Forest Elephants be Reclassified as Apes?" Spoof paper. I just wanted to go to the primate conference in Strasbourg. But what I said was, they have the same social organization as chimps, the same reaction to human beings, habituation process as gorillas, and basically they have a gorilla diet. The only difference is they can't climb trees, basically. Rainforest elephants are very different to savanna elephants. They're fruit eaters, and because the fruit patch is so discrete, it's a tree canopy, you can't have 30, 40, 50 elephants in an extended matriarchal family that eat grass in the savanna eating fruit underneath a rainforest tree, because there's just not enough to go around. And so piecing together how the rainforest elephants lived, eventually fitting them with satellite collars and tracking them around the forest. And it ended up, because Kate and I have been very stubborn and kept going for 30, 40 years, the phenology circuits that the chimp and gorilla people started just to look at chimp and gorilla movements around the forest, that they were only going to do for 3 years, we're still collecting that data. So it started in 1983. Kate still has teams out there collecting the data. We discovered that over the last 30 years, fruiting in central Gabon, because of climate change, is down 80%. Fruit production is down 80%, 80%. And because elephants don't have fur, and because every single researcher that visits Lope wants to take pictures of elephants, we were able to compile about 60,000 pictures of elephants with time code over the period and prove that they are statistically thinner. They have, you can see the ribs and the backbones much more clearly today than you could 20, 30 years ago. It's the most sinister paper I think I have my name on. I call it the Hungry Elephants paper. Similarly with mandrills, Darwin described them as the most colorful of the mammals, the most spectacular of the mammals. Disney was inspired by them to create Rafiki in The Lion King. When we started and when Kate started studying mandrills, they were thought of as forest baboons. It transpired as she was discovering they don't behave like baboons. Genetically, they were being shown not to be baboons, but more closely related to mangabes. They live in groups of 600, 700, 800 We counted 1,350 once. We began studying the mandrills and their ranging and their diet, and discovered that it's not just the diallium that they're crunching up a lot of different seeds, and so acting more like a seed predator than a seed disperser. And when 1,000 mandrills come through your patch of forest, there's not that much left once they've moved on. That's one of our young field assistants. We didn't have a very big budget, so we had to make use of everybody that we could. Studying the mandrills led us to studying the top predator. You can't understand the primate without understanding its predator. Actually, the top predator, sadly, is us, and probably has been for hundreds of thousands of years. But leopards do also eat them, and occasionally pythons. And so I had the privilege for about 10 years to learn this new language, to study the forest, to get to know the forest, to start thinking about the dynamics and how the forest has changed over time. But we realized that all around us, the forest was being cut, logged, degraded, hunted. The NGOs described what was going on as the bushmeat crisis. Hundreds of thousands, millions of animals were being shot across the Congo Basin. And we were faced by the choice: do we keep studying these amazing ecosystems until they're gone? Or do we try to do something about it? And luckily there were two of us, and so Kate continued to do more science, and I got sucked out into the world of conservation and conservation politics. We used the images that we'd created, and we used science to plan a network of 13 national parks across Gabon that we were able to convince President Omar Bongo to declare by law. 13 national parks, 11% of Gabon suddenly protected. He cancelled 2 million hectares of logging concessions that were about to be cut. I ended up being named by Ali Bongo as head of national parks. I've grown my hair now. I realized after 15 years, 10 years in a paramilitary organization, and then 4 years as a government minister, where if your hair gets longer than about 2 millimeters, they think you're a hippie and they don't listen to you. I realized after 15 years that my kids had never seen me with hair. My mother was missing my curls. So we had to turn biologists into warriors, basically, because the traffickers linked to Boko Haram were eliminating Africa's elephants. DRC went from 400,000 elephants to 5,000 elephants in a period of about 15 to 20 years. In Gabon, we basically had to go to war with Boko Haram and the organized criminal networks to save the elephant. And we were fairly successful. The population went from 1990, about 60,000, to 95,000 in 2020. 2 in 3 forest elephants live in Gabon. Gabon and Congo are the only places where they've really survived. I was able to, as I transitioned from scientist to park manager to presidential advisor, I was able to use and abuse all of my friends like Yadvinder and Simon Lewis to do science that I could use to push these international agendas, like the climate change negotiations and so on. We were seeing, the red bits are where there's lots of deforestation in the Congo Basin. So Eastern Congo Basin, we're losing 1 million hectares every year right now. We started worrying that the Congo Basin might go the way of West Africa. If you look at Ivory Coast, it's just like Britain. You think about how degraded Britain is. 3% of the British rainforest survive. 3% of Ivory Coast rainforests survive. Gabon and Britain are kind of on a level pegging. Gabon, 88% forest. We don't want Gabon to become Ivory Coast, because if it does, there won't be any more rainfall in Ethiopia, Blue Nile won't flow, and there'll be 100 million Egyptian climate refugees heading into Italy and Greece. I'm speeding up now because I'm about to finish. So I'm giving you the sound bites. I was instructed to look into illegal logging. We discovered a $400 million a year illegal Chinese forestry mafia stealing, Gabon's riches, illegally exploiting the forest, kind of decimating the forest. And when the news broke, the president fired the vice president and the minister of forestry, and 2 weeks later, I was the new minister of forestry. So I'd finally made that complete transition from being the nerdy scientist, quite antisocial. I think my first 3 years in Gabon, I might have left the forest 2 or 3 times, to being on the international stage, kind of communicating science, trying to use science to influence what is going on in this world. Because I have a firm belief, and my own belief, it's quite convenient, but I really am convinced that maintaining the rainforests of the Congo Basin is utterly critical to maintaining the stability of the African continent. The rainforests are the pumping heart of Africa. The forests of Congo Basin, the Amazon, are the 2 pumping ventricles of the Earth's heart. And using, sometimes slightly abusing the science, sometimes pushing it a little bit further. How much of the Ethiopian rainfall really is coming from the Congo Basin? We know some is. We don't know if it's 20% or 60%. Sometimes pushing those grey areas a little bit far. Standing up to John Kerry at the climate COP, where, as I said, it hit me very hard in the second week of the Glasgow climate COP. I was speaking for 1.3 billion Africans. If we lose the Congo Basin forest, if we lose the fight against climate change, there's probably going to be 500 million climate and water refugees in Africa. It's a question of life and death for many people, and I was the one speaking for them. Working with Zach Goldsmith at the time, pushing the 30-30 agenda, because we're not just living through a period of climate change, we're also living through the 6th biodiversity extinction on this planet. And so, 2 more minutes. In some respects, I became the chimpanzee in the room. I became the human speaking up for nature. And I think a lot of people in this room would see themselves in a similar light. We understand the importance of biodiversity. We're interested in how we restore the degraded systems of this world. Why are we interested in that? Because we think that the Earth would be a better, more stable place, more livable place, if we can achieve that. And to achieve that, we have to convince people. We have to talk to people. We have to tell our stories in a convincing manner, so that the politicians of this world, that mostly have a little 1 or 2 year horizon in front of them, will actually take some bold, longer term decisions. You see China doing it. You see, I think many of the Congo Basin countries are being much bolder on preservation of ecosystem services than nations in the West. Perhaps partly because they often have a slightly longer political horizon in those countries. But if we're going to govern the Earth on the basis of what's going to happen in the next 18 months, we're going to make some very, very, very bad decisions. And so, kind of since my liberation, since I was given a sabbatical by President Oligui in Gabon, I've been doing various things. I've been working with the science panel for the Congo Basin. They call me their special envoy. So I'm the special envoy of an organization with no formal legal existence. But it was the scientists of the Congo Basin. And the thing that shocked me the most about the Congo Basin Science Panel was that when we did the inventory of how many publishing scientists are there from the Congo Basin countries, we found 110. There are 6,000 publishing scientists in the Amazon. There are 110 of all the kind of 16 Congo Basin countries. And there has been very, very little investment in understanding the importance of the Congo Basin. The climate modelers will tell us, we know the Congo Basin is critical to Earth kind of climate patterns. We don't know in what way. We cannot predict. Our models will not predict what will happen if we lose the Congo Basin. We just don't have the ground data. And so I'm kind of going a little bit back to science, representing the few scientists that are out there, trying to tell these scientific stories to the rest of the world, and trying to create momentum for the preservation and the restoration of all these critical ecosystems. And in maybe 18 months' time, you might invite me back, and I might have some good ideas about how to do that. Sorry, I went.
Thank you, Lee. I thought we'd indulge your politician instincts to go a little bit over time.
Give a politician the floor.
That's okay. But it was important to
I was once banned by Amy Vedder from WCS for going to any of her policy retreats because I never said anything. She used to invite Kate, who didn't work for WCS, because she was the one who would say lots of things in these meetings, and I would just sit there because I only spoke when I didn't agree with what they were saying. Now you can't shut me up.
Well, I think we'll allow about 20 minutes for questions. If some of you need to go, feel free to sneak out. And there's a drinks reception afterwards if you want a more informal conversation. So does anybody want to kick off? Very good. Dan?
Yes, you've done.
Put it online.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. You've done both science and politics. What does the Congo Basin need most now?
We need to maintain the Congo Basin forests. How do you do that? You don't do it through donor money, because it's impossible to spend and it has very little impact. You can't do that through handouts. Politicians can't take decisions about their economies and the future of their countries based on maybe USAID might give me some money. And so I think what we need and what we tried to create in Gabon is we need an economic model that will preserve these forests. Now, in Gabon is about 25% protected right now on land and in the oceans. 27% in the ocean, 24% on land. There's another 60% of Gabon in logging concessions. It's selective logging, so you cut 1 to 2 trees per hectare every 25 years. And you protect the forest in the meantime, you let it regenerate, and you protect the wildlife. And so basically, those concessions are IUCN Category 6 protected areas. But by banning log export, we were able to increase the forest economy ×5 over a period of 15 years, and increase the jobs for Gabonese people ×4, more or less. And so we created an economic model that attributed value to the forest. Now, if we rely on just forestry and trying to push, when you export a log, you're exporting 95% of the value and 95% of the jobs. It's the same thing with cocoa in Ghana. 5% of the chocolate industry revenues go to the chocolate producing countries, the cocoa producing countries. It's the same with cashew nuts and cotton. It's the same with mineral resources in Eastern DRC. If you export your minerals raw, you're going to make 10 to 20 times less from them and have 10 to 20 times less jobs. And so we need to maintain these forests. I think the only way we're going to be able to do that is if we can create economic models whereby they are worth more standing than dead. And the Gabon experiment seems to be working. The stress test was 2023. The current government is continuing many of the environmental policies and are investing in transformation, and they're shifting that transformation idea from wood to the mining industry now. And so that maybe is a good stress test of what we achieved. But we have to shift that model that Africa is the source of cheap raw materials that help the rest of the world to develop and provide employment to the rest of the world, to creating sustainable development in Africa, in the Congo Basin countries, and trying to explain to people the fact that if you do that by destroying your natural resources, if you lose the Congo Basin, what is it, 60% of the water, the rainfall in the Congo Basin is recycled through the trees. Lose the trees, you lose the agriculture. So you have to develop whilst also preserving those ecosystem services. And maybe they can do it better than we did.
I'll take one here and up there.
Hi,
Hi.
thank you for the presentation and the storytelling. I really enjoyed the little anecdotes along the way. I'm Lilita, and I'm in the Biodiversity Conservation and Nature Recovery class, masters. And I picked up on the kind of the colonial legacies that have shaped how the forests have been structured. And especially I found interesting that there used to be people who lived in these forests, so who were then forcibly removed, and how these forests still hold those stories. So I'm wondering, I kind of have two questions that are combined. And the first is, as a white man from the UK, how do you position yourself as someone who's coming from one of the former colonizing countries into Africa and presenting solutions for forest management? How do you position yourself within that kind of reality? And then the second one is have there been any efforts to bring back the communities who were forcibly removed from the forest, and are there still people who are living off the forest, and perhaps how are they preserving the forests, and what could one learn from their knowledge? Thank you.
I'll start with the second one, which Gabon is about 87% urban today, and the rural people are fleeing rural areas and moving to the cities. There are still rural communities. There are some, what we used to call pygmy communities. It's kind of the easiest way to describe them. There are 9 different tribes of forest people, if you prefer. Anthropologists want to call them hunter-gatherers these days, but I can't quite bring myself to do that. There are Bantu tribes that know the forest fairly well. But a lot of the tradition involves cutting the forest down to grow crops, particularly the Bantu people. Some of the pygmy people have incredible knowledge of the forest. So we can learn a lot from them, but they live a life where they're more a part of the ecosystem than most human beings. Most human beings are outside of the ecosystem and use it. Some of the forest people kind of behave a bit more like they are a natural part of the forest, but I don't think that helps us too much. because most of humanity is not going to adopt that lifestyle. We're not going to go back to that lifestyle. So we have to find ways to make sort of modern technology and modern economies and so on, work alongside preserving nature. I can't really answer the first question. It's, as I said, it's somewhat ironic that I'm also called White. People didn't have too much of an issue remembering my name in Africa. I grew up in Africa. I'm a naturalized Gabonese citizen. Everybody in this room, I think, is descended from 12 matrilineal lines that walked out of Africa 60,000 years ago. So we're all African, really. There's more genetic diversity in Africa than the whole of the rest of the world. Bizarrely, it's very, very, very rare over my 40 years that Africans ask me that question. It's usually white people, Europeans, who ask that question. And I usually feel like responding by saying, take a look at the French football team or the English football team. It's true there's this colonial history and there's kind of perhaps that legacy of my ancestors in Africa. But I spent my life doing what I thought was right by the ecosystems and the people and trying to create the sustainable development model that makes people's lives better. And I kind of just set the old white guy thing to the side because I can't change that.
Excellent, thank you. I'm struck not only in this talk, but a few other ones that we've had throughout this series that sometimes you can't go for one field season or study in one place for 1 year. You do have to stay there for decades and decades to see that complexity or to be able to identify differences over time. Can you speak a little bit more to this sort of the necessity of being immersed in the field for a longer period of time to really get to know it as you have or as MIF has?
No, I decided to basically spend my whole career in Gabon. I fell in love with Gabon's forests, but I felt that that's how I could be most effective. A lot of conservationists or scientists choose to work in all sorts of places. And so there's no one strategy. Yadvinder works all around the world, but he often works with people like Kate and I, and we kind of combine that global view and experience from other parts of the world with that really in-depth view of how something works in Lope. And often you need that detailed view to interpret the data that comes from these these wider studies, and you definitely need that your feet grounded on in the soil if you're going to apply all of these global models that we have now. And often we kind of look at the modeling papers and we kind of think that doesn't work. So I think you need both. We have to have long-term sites and we have to have a profound understanding of how these things work. Lope, just because Kate particularly stuck it out for so long, is the only place we could do that hungry elephant study. But it's now looking like the primates in Kibale Forest are going through the same problem, and that productivity in the Ghanaian forest is down as well. And so I think it's really important that we invest in some key long-term reference sites, because you do get different perspectives when you have that long-term vision.
Hi, Lee. Thank you for a wonderful talk. I was really struck by this sort of mix of your knowledge of this plant species and then your time perspective. It's very inspiring. And I was wondering, you mentioned this pattern where this Dutch botanist was drawn to the piece of the forest that he found that looked most like ancient forest, but was actually then dominated by these disturbance-dependent tree species that were then very old. And then linking that to what you know about elephants, I wondered, you didn't mention necessarily ivory trade, but I wondered what do we know anything about sort of good baseline numbers for abundances of elephants in Gabon, even not just 500 years ago, but maybe even before that? Because I know now in Southern Africa, there seems to be sort of an elephant problem in Botswana and South Africa, where it seems African ecologists think there's starting to be too many elephants, and they're ruining the pretty trees. And can we just start shooting them now because it's too much? I wonder, in a place like that where it seems like sort of savanna versus rainforest, it seems like a dynamic, even though obviously changing through centuries. I wonder what you think about sort of what Gabon might have looked like before intense human hunting of elephants, maybe 1,000 years ago.
We know that during the transatlantic trade, that they basically emptied the sedimentary basin of Gabon of elephants, and they had to go 5, 6, 10 days inland to find elephants. And they also more or less eliminated the native rubber tree and the black ebony, and so that period of trade had a huge impact on wildlife, and some of the early explorers, Du Chaillu, de Brazza, they kind of write about hundreds of hippos in the Ogwe Delta, hundreds of huge crocodiles on sandbanks, troops of 600 buffalo in the Bateke Plateau, and it's rare to see 5 buffalo together today in the Bateke Plateau. So even though Gabon is the last Eden, as National Geographic describes it, and it's relatively intact, the human footprint is felt, and there was obviously a huge amount more wildlife before there were guns and so on. Too many elephants. I think savanna elephant and forest elephant ecology is quite different. I've never seen a situation where forest elephants are really killing all the trees and degrading. I've just never seen it. I think the biology is different. The savanna elephants seem to have these cycles of destruction and famine, but the reality is that we're cutting off all the migratory paths of the savanna elephants, and we're restricting them to smaller and smaller areas, and so sometimes even fenced in. So if you take out the hunting and poaching that probably has been going on for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years, and you put them in these artificial small areas, then inevitably the system is not going to work, and you're going to get those extremes. So how you deal with that? Do you use regenerative corridors to reestablish corridors between parks for elephants? In places like Gabon, you can think about doing having those corridors and trying to restrict agriculture where you do have elephant corridors and try and keep the people away from the elephants. But we have a huge problem in Gabon of human-elephant conflict and elephants eating people's crops, and that might be partly related to the climate change, so the fruiting crash. So maybe they're just getting less fruit in the forest and they're having to come out to eat people's crops. But also they've been protected for 30 years, and where there was 30 years ago, there was a band of 10 kilometers either side of every road with no elephants. And today you see elephants on the main roads because they've been protected. And so that ends up being bad for elephants. they end up killing people, and people end up killing elephants. And so, yeah, that equilibrium is difficult. It may be more difficult in savanna systems than forest systems, but it's difficult everywhere. Too many people and not enough space for nature.
Okay, great. I think I'll wrap up there. Just to wrap up, I remember when I first came across Lee and Kate's field guide to Lope. We saw the illustration from there. That what I was wrapped up in was the way that field guide didn't just identify the plants, but told the stories that the plants told. And I think it's rare to have a talk that actually spans this intimate knowledge of the stories of the forest and how trees can tell stories that span centuries and millennia, and then also spans all the way to the languages of nations and geopolitics.
When I walked around Witham Woods with you a few weeks ago, you did it back to me.
It's slightly easier in White, so I'll say my experience. So it's wonderful to just the resonance of scales and the intimacy of nature with the global issues around the Congo Basin and its future. So thanks, Lee, for a wonderful talk. Come and join us for drinks afterwards. Bye.